1757 was the year when the first boatload of slaves arrived in the Cape. Now, the Jan van Riebeeck had written off to request these slaves because he said he could not make the Khoisan work hard enough. And that was because in their own economy, they didn't have a notion of wage labor. They didn't work for somebody else. They were herders and hunters. So, you know, I would own a few sheep, some cattle, and I would herd them. And whatever I needed to gather from the environment, that's what I would do. But there was not this notion generally of I don't own anything, so I need to go to you to make money. And the main reason for that was the Khoi did not have private property in land. So there was no real basis on which to build a market economy. Now, the other thing that meant is that they could not understand slavery. I mean, if they had very little understanding for buying and selling labor, they had even less understanding for buying and selling a human being. So when the first boatloads of slaves arrived and they and the Khoisan worked together, the first thing the Khoisan did was help the slaves escape. And this was, of course, important. When you're in a completely foreign country and you don't know where to go, you need somebody from that country to say, go here, you can get food there, my cousin lives over that mountain, continue in that direction. And lo and behold, within 3 months of arriving, the slaves began to run away. And Jan van Riebeeck, of course, couldn't capture them. He didn't know the country at all. So what he did is he kidnapped 4 of the Khoisan leaders. He took Eva, also known as Krotoa, who was the translator. He took Auchema, he was a guerrilla leader. He took Gonema and he took Dauman, and he put them on Robben Island. And they ended up being the first political prisoners on Robben Island. And he said, I'm going to keep you here until such time as those slaves are returned. Essentially, he took them as hostages. And that was the cause of what's known as the First Khoi-Dutch War.
You know, the old people used to call Cape Town Table Mountain Jabal Saleh, the mountain of piety. And it is highly blessed in many ways that there are slaves and unknown graves that we don't even know of. And if one looks at from Oude Kraal, one goes back to where Deer Park is, that was a slave walk. And slaves would meet up there in secret and so on, carrying up wood, meeting there, washing, whatever the case, even meeting there in the evenings. And if one looks at that strip of land, I know at one stage UNESCO wanted to make this a slave walk, a heritage site and so on.
A system of coercion can only be maintained for a certain period of time because it goes against human nature to be coerced, to be controlled. And eventually, maybe we should look at the forms of coercion, the forms of punishment meted out to the slaves. The most popular one was flogging. And they had some box with which they flogged their slaves for any transgression, whatever the transgression might be. Then there was putting the slave on, especially in the Dutch period, putting the slave on the wheel, which they called the rack. And they would break your limbs with an iron bar. Or, in the case of arson, there's one guy in 1714, one slave tried to torture his owner's house. He tried a few times, but he failed. Eventually, he was tied with a chain to a post. And this chain was just long enough for him to run around this pole. And the fire was started, and he was scorched alive. And many slaves who committed arson were punished in that form. You could also be branded with a hot iron on your cheek, or your ear could be cut off, or a finger could be cut off. That's why I say if you compare the methods of torture used at Guantanamo Bay, or the methods of torture used during the apartheid era, then that fades into oblivion if you compare it to what the Dutch did to slaves who transgressed. So for how long could they keep it? They couldn't. And eventually the philanthropists and those people who were in favor of the abolition of slavery, in 1807, the British passed a law that all slave trade in the British Empire will now be abolished. 1834, slaves were set free. 1838, they were finally free after service.